and said that firstly, 17 settlements were destroyed by monsters, and all the refugees started to flee here, but the Viscount drove them away. He looked at him with a gloomy look and suggested pretending that he didn't know anything about it, but Her Majesty would be very upset if he found out about it. The man, white with fear, wondered where the benefit was for him if this was blackmail. The brown-haired man clasped his hands and started talking about the second point, noting that he was saying this only in his own interests. He smiled sweetly and said that if he wrote a letter of recommendation, perhaps Diego would be able to return to the academy. Sweat began to flow down Racona's face. He began to gulp air greedily. Gritting his teeth tightly, the Viscount asked how much he would raise the tax. The protagonist ran his hand through his hair and asked why he was talking like that, because people might think that he was a criminal who came to be rude to him. However, he looked at the man with disdain, saying that in order not to embarrass him, he would raise it just a little, enough so that their friendship would continue. The Viscount, white with horror, mentally asked him to just tell him the amount. Xavier stood behind Lloyd. With a gloomy face, he mentally noted the gentleman's character. The guy, clasping his hands in a lock, asked him not to be so modest and just tell him how much more he could raise it. He said that it did not matter to him how much it took, because in any case he would be grateful for his kindness. The man bared his teeth. An oppressive aura began to hover in the office. The Viscount looked at the brown-haired man. He narrowed his eyes. He darkened, and Racona began to speak. Moving his lips, he named the number 20. The protagonist crossed his lips in a cartoonish manner. The man's eyes widened. Extending a trembling hand, he exclaimed that he had made a mistake. The man froze, muttering, "The party's meant." Lloyd began to mentally press, biting his lip. Breathing heavily, the Viscount pulled his collar. He looked to the side with a puzzled look. Xavier showed him the number 5. Racona abruptly put his hands on the table and exclaimed that he would raise taxes by 50%. The guy gritted his teeth disgustingly. The man looked in shock at the knight, who was trying to understand what was wrong with his master. He shook his head. The blonde showed the number 5 again, thinking that he was waiting for it to end. The Viscount rose to his feet, exclaiming, "Sue raises taxes 5 times," and asked, "Is this really not enough?" The brown-haired man put his hands in front of him and worriedly asked what this meant, adding that 4 times would be more than enough. A joyful smile appeared on Racona's face. He immediately put his seal. After a while, the protagonist happily understood the document. At that moment, the man looked at the contract. Suddenly, his face changed. He grabbed his head and buried his face in the table. Lloyd looked at his comrade and asked what was wrong with his face. He replied that he felt like a thief. The guy pointed his finger at him, saying that yes, he was a swindler, but he was also a blackmailer. He was glad to help him, which means that this makes him an accomplice of the swindler, and it turns out that he is also a swindler. A vein bulged on the knight's face. Leading the horses by the reins, he said that his duty was to accompany the young master, and then noted that he was no longer going to be his errand boy and would not participate in the construction either. The brown-haired man said that in that case, he would no longer sing him a lullaby. The fair-haired man threw him a smug look and said that he had been a sword master for a month now, and now he could control his feelings and emotions much better, and he did not even need a lullaby anymore. Night fell in the castle. The knight with red eyes and held the pillow. Together with it, he came to the master, saying that he needed a lullaby. The protagonist told him that such a service was unavailable, because he himself said that he no longer needed it. Xavier began to beg him. Lloyd grinned and asked if he had ever heard of sleep hygiene. He said that these are some kind of habits and exercises that lead to a full sleep on a regular basis, and once the habit is formed, it will be difficult for him to fall asleep without this procedure. Gritting his teeth, the parquet shook, saying that he knew what it was about, and then demanded a lullaby. When the brown-haired man sang, he fell asleep on the chair. He stretched his arms, saying that now it was time to get to work. The protagonist laid out the papers on the table. Then he created holograms of high-rise buildings. Looking at them, he thought that when it came to the heating system, he had a lot of knowledge, but he did not have enough knowledge to build an apartment complex. Suddenly, one of the houses began to collapse. As he knelt down, the administrator asked if he was really going to create simulations one after another. Lloyd replied that he even had a phrase for such a case. Grinning, he said that we need to work until we succeed. After a while, dawn came. The guy walked down the street with his comrades, telling them to send people to Cremo, and that they needed a foreman, masons, carpenters, and then ordered the mobilization of the entire workforce as soon as possible. He also said to make sure that all the building materials are always available, and not to forget to bring in grain and meat because they need them as soon as possible. At night, he created a benefit for the city again. During the day, the man told him that 300 more refugees came to them, but they have more. The protagonist loudly told him to accept every single one, because they will find a way to accommodate them all. At night he was working on a drawing, trying to figure out how to do it, and thought that the process was taking too long. A drop of blood fell on the drawing. Licking the blood from his nose, the face thought that he should not reduce his gold mine, but stabilize the buildings. A new day had come. Bayern, looking at the gentleman, said that based on the dawns, in 4 months they will have no more money left, except for what goes to pay for the processing of soldiers. He asked if they could deviate from the original plan and move some refugees to other lands. The guy with bruises under his eyes quietly told him not to worry about it, because they had enough funds. He began to fall. When he fell to the ground, his comrades came to him, screaming loudly. The brown-haired man was unconscious. The kingdom of Magentano. The knights loaded their crossbows. In the center of the hall stood a woman. In her hands was a sword. The commander raised his hand. Raku let go. He gave the order to shoot. Many arrows flew at the woman. She raised her sword. Then she struck it. Alicia began to strike many times. The chopped arrows began to fall to the floor. The knights looked at him with shock and respect. The woman pursed her lips in displeasure, thinking that nothing had changed, and she only began to create the aura sword faster. Remembering the battle, she mentally called herself a loser and thought that she could not afford to disgrace herself like this again. An olive tree came up to her and called her. When Alicia turned around, he told her that a messenger had arrived from the Frontera estate. After a while, they found themselves in the main hall. Opening the scroll, Xavier said that her humble servant asked for a helping hand. The woman tensed up, wondering what had happened. Remembering Lloyd's treacherous face, she mentally asked what kind of story he had dragged them into this time. His messenger was sitting in front of her with a letter. Xavier was kneeling and reading a letter to Queen Alicia, addressing her as the soul of their kingdom, who had to show them the way with her great insight, because they were standing on this land with their last strength, trying to protect their estate. And unfortunately, as he told in the last letter, refugees from 17 states lost their homes. A bunch of refugees were walking along a forest path with their belongings and children because they were all heading towards their estate. The queen, with a sullen look, leaned her head on her hand when she listened that she should show compassion to all her people, because she is the one who has a great spirit, and accordingly a great will, and as a loyal subject of the great queen, he accepts ordinary people with open arms, believes that they all deserve their attention. He held this letter anxiously and dared to let these people feel her great will, although he knew that he did not write this text. Alicia looked at him angrily when he said that he wanted to take care of all the great people of the kingdom, but she tried to understand what he meant. The knight was on one knee, imagining the main character crying because he was broke. The queen immediately frowned with fury at such impudence of her comrade, because it was unexpected, but she still thought about sending the necessary help. Xavier continued to hold the letter and turned to the queen, saying that they would need 3 times more money than they could imagine. Alicia again frowned angrily at such impudence. Xavier continued to look at the letter with alarm and said that her humble servant was not a bit crazy. The queen grabbed her head with an angry look, because she was very angry and the next time she saw him, she would take revenge on him. He imagined the protagonist showing a blueprint of a building on a piece of paper and saying that he planned to build the most innovative multi-story residential building in the entire kingdom of Magenta, because they wanted to build not just a building for refugees to sleep and eat in, but to provide them with permanent housing and help them become independent, and they also wanted to show them the great will of the queen. The protagonist then clenched his fists with tears in his eyes and said that he was left without money. Alicia sat on her throne, stretching her hand out towards the knight and told him to stop, because she already understood the meaning of the letter. Alicia sighed, waving her hand, and told the knight to tell the protagonist that just because she was the queen did not mean she could throw money around as she pleased. The woman leaned her head on her hand, crossed her legs, and stated that she would ask permission from the Minister of Finance and other advisors as well as permission from her stubborn elders, and nothing good would come of bothering them even more. The knight reached into his inner jacket pocket. Then he pulled out another letter. Alicia stared at it. It was the image of the protagonist, who was smiling maliciously against the backdrop of a burning building, because it was designed as a fortress. And in the future, if the monster attacks again or the enemy attacks from the east, such a building will become an impenetrable defense, and they will play a key role in the peace and welfare of the Magentano kingdom. Alicia tilted her head and listened with disdain that this is how the city will be built, and this is how they can protect the eastern part from the enemy. The protagonist smiled mockingly, covering his hand and pointing his finger, declaring that he will personally present a nice gift to whoever supports this project. Alicia, with disdain, looked at the sarcastic grin of the protagonist, sitting on the throne opposite the knight. The queen leaned her head on her hand with a puzzled look and thought that first of all, building a fortified city wasn't such a bad idea. After all, according to preliminary estimates, the costs could be as high as a trading city like Cremo. She looked away intently, thinking that the loyalty of the ministers who kept their positions thanks to her projection had increased, and this would definitely strengthen her position and authority. After all, it would be obvious that they would only benefit. The knight continued to sit on the carpet in front of the queen and said the word bingo, explaining that he didn't know exactly what it meant, but the letter said bingo in 5 seconds. The queen leaned her cheek on her hand, looking indifferent. The girl sat on the throne, clutching it with her hands, and told Xavier to wait here until she brought the money and counted on him. Xavier continued to sit with the letter in his hands in front of the queen and added that it would be great if Master Corgidus could also come and urge the queen to understand everything. The rays of the sun enveloped the mountain plain city. A bunch of white tents with chimneys stood in a clearing. The workers carried heavy bags when the brown-haired man shouted that Lloyd would not forgive them for their laziness and sloppiness. The sergeant continued to frown and shout to his comrades while they tried to understand who he was. The workers looked ahead in bewilderment, and at first glance this sergeant seemed to be just a lazy soldier from the platoon, but he was always there. Greg in the memories stood in front of the main character, who was beating Nikita at that moment. This guy was also tied together with other comrades, and no matter the danger of the task, he continued to be there. Lloyd remembered how Greg came into his room to help, because regardless of the difficulty of the work, this man, who was reborn as a real man and more responsible than others and always giving his all. Greg at that moment was carrying a backpack and screaming bloodthirstily. Now this sergeant was accepting a blanket in a tent where bundled refugees were sitting, when one of them asked to pass an old blanket to the old people and children. Then the sergeant came out of the tent. He saw in front of him the maid Emily, who was carrying blankets. He was going to approach her, pointing his finger at her, saying that she should take a break because she had been working since early morning. The girl replied that the sergeant should mind his own business because she still needed to sort out things. The sergeant angrily waved his hand in front of the brunette because he wanted to do everything for her, but she refused. Emily was beaming with an admiring smile. The brown-haired man also smiled widely in response. He immediately ran after her playfully when an orc with flowers appeared. It was an orc with red hair who looked sad. He saw a smiling brunette. All the other orcs began to laugh at their comrade because he fell in love with a human. Despite the fact that their people are stupid, he still looked stupider because a human woman will never accept their ugly faces and terrible muscles. This orc with red hair looked sad with a trembling look when they laughed at him. He immediately dropped the flowers from the field from his hands. Then he began to walk away between the tents. The brunette noticed this and cast her glance. She looked at the orc warrior, leaving with surprise. In his imagination, he was leaving the girl when she looked at him tremblingly. Suddenly, the main character woke up in a sweat. The system began to ask him about what happened because he scared her. He lay on the bed with a sick look and said that he just had a dream. Bayern at this time sat on a chair in front of the protagonist, assuming that their master had gone crazy. The main character looked dejected and half dead, saying that now there was not much left. The protagonist pressed his lips and said that it was already close. He turned his head away with a sick look and said that he was waiting for payday when he lost consciousness. Bayern looked at him angrily with sweat on his brow. At this time, Xavier was walking down the corridor. Bayern immediately rushed to cheer up the protagonist, who began to go into hysterics, trying to understand where his money was and their reserves were depleted. Bayern began to say that they just needed to postpone the payment and he was sure that everyone would understand. Lloyd opened his mouth in horror and said that the matter was completely different. Xavier at that moment was walking down the corridor of the palace. The protagonist clutched the blanket to his chest and said that he had worked very hard for payday and that it could not be delayed. Bayern tried to reach out to the saddened Lloyd, who asked him not to do this to him, even if he was gone. He looked sick in the sweat of his brow and was almost closing his eye. Then he closed his eyes and passed out. Bayern immediately became embittered and began to furiously bring the master to his senses. He immediately looked back and shouted for a doctor when Xavier entered the room. The knight looked cold-blooded through his bangs. Bayern looked at him in the sweat of his brow with angrily. The sun's light illuminated the knight's cheek. He pulled out a banknote from his backpack and said that he had received his salary and ordered the protagonist to quickly get up. At this time, Lloyd in a dark appearance began to laugh maliciously because he had received a special skill. Bayern, baring his teeth, looked at what was happening in bewilderment. He saw how Lloyd stood up on the bed and looked in a demonic bloodthirsty smile. Notification about the financial hill. The protagonist opened his mouth wide with a sarcastic grin and was happy that they would be able to start because the estate had received funds to develop the Royal City project. Bayern stood in a white shirt with the rest of his comrades, with tools, shouting that the gold mine apartment complex project was 70% complete and everyone should hold out. It was a huge deserted clearing surrounded by a fence. At this time, the protagonist stretched out his arms and emitted a green aura. He stood on a hill and raised his hands, raising the silhouette of a building. Then, with a piercing gaze, he lowered his hand with 2 fingers. Building complexes began to appear from the ground. Everything around was shrouded in smoke and dust. Huge multi-story silhouettes of buildings appeared on this clearing. Lloyd waved his arms, spreading his legs wide. Then a powerful vortex of air began to blow everything. A moment later, the wind stopped and the silhouettes of buildings appeared. Lloyd raised his hands above his head and looked down, realizing that now there was a final check. He stood on a hill and stretched his arms to the sky, emitting light. He directed a stream from the ground to the sky. It was outer space with the planet Earth. A star beam flew to our planet. It was a